That's correct, Lisa. Hello, everyone. We will start in about 1 minute as people continue to come into the room. We will start in about 1 minute. Okay, folks, thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Tracy Quarter and my pronouns are she, her. I am here to welcome you to our webinar teaching about election 2020 and what is next for the defund movement. Next slide. We are the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom, also known as People's Coalition or PCSF. We are base building and member-led grassroots organizations, racial justice policy and advocacy institutions. We're mostly led by Black and queer organizations. We represent a cross-section of communities impacted by systems of criminalization and incarceration. And we are committed to the transforming of the justice system and redefining public safety. Next slide. So if you look at these logos, this is the People's Coalition Steering Committee. Shout out to BYP 100, CPD, BAJI, Dream Defenders, the Leadership Conference, Law for Black Lives, Just Leadership USA, Policy Link, National Council, ACRE, and the Justice Team Network. So that is our steering committee. Next slide. So tonight we are, I just did the introduction, the grounding, and who we are. Dave Pringle is going to walk us through the results of the 2020 election. We have a phenomenal, we're calling it a panel, but it's going to be a conversation coming up about what this means for the defund movement. And then we're going to go into some action steps. So next slide. Our goal is to dismantle and replace racist, harmful, and punitive policies that have fueled the crisis of criminalization and incarceration facing the United States, with policies and budgets that invest in our community and decarcerate our country. Next slide. So we talk a lot about the 1994 crime bill. That was passed in 1994 under President Bill Clinton at the time. Many of you have heard about it. Major components are it implemented the 3 strikes rule and mandatory minimum sentences. It did truth in sentencing laws and incentives. The COPS program, which is still in effect, that has established $19 billion, with a B, $19 billion to expand policing in U.S. cities. It authorized $10 billion in subsidies to expand state prisons. It ended Pell Grants for those in prison. It gave us the Violence Against Women Act and a federal assault weapons ban. Next slide. So what we want, our community should shape public dollars and the resources that are created from them. We want housing, healthcare, education, parks, things for our youth, transit, and jobs. And we feel like having those things means we won't need people to be locked up and removed from our communities. Next slide. So we're going to ask you to share your story with us. Every time we are able to gather together, one of the things I say is, what a time to be in movement. 2020 has done a lot to pull us away from each other, but it also has done so much to bring us together. So I want y'all to share your stories. Tag People's Coalition. If you see it's there, it's PPLS_coalition, and share why defund is hashtag more than a slogan in your community. So if you share hashtag more than a slogan, we want to hear those stories. We want to hear why defund is more than that, and we will share those, and we will continue to have a conversation. So I'm going to pass it over to Dave Pringle to give us an election breakdown.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. My name is Dave Pringle. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a policy and campaign manager with the Center for Popular Democracy on the Education and Justice Transformation teams. Tonight, I just want to talk to you all a little bit about the results of this past election. We'll talk a little about what we saw happen in the presidential race, as well as what we saw happening in the Senate and the House. And hopefully that will lead us comfortably into a conversation about what we think this means for our movement moving forward, and what we think the impact of the executive branch and what we think will be happening in Congress, what that will do to our ability to actually enact some of these changes that we'd like to see in our communities. We can go to the next slide, please. So by now, hopefully you all have seen that the results are pretty much certified. The Supreme Court has just recently rejected the campaign, I should say, latest attempt to circumvent the results of the election. As you can see, Joe Biden was able to pull together 306 electoral votes, winning back key swing states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. In addition, adding Arizona and Georgia to the total, bringing his electoral college total to 306 votes. Unfortunately, Texas has recently filed a new lawsuit challenging the results of the election, and 17 states have actually joined in that lawsuit. Missouri, Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Indiana, Kansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, and West Virginia have unfortunately joined along in Texas's lawsuit. We don't expect those those challenges to go very far in the courts. The results are pretty clear. There has been no evidence of widespread voter fraud. One thing I did want to point out, though, the reason you see that funky looking map on the right side of your screen there is I just wanted to remind everyone that what we're seeing in terms of land and what we're seeing in terms of who's voting are not the same thing. And so you'll often, hear, folks make a reference to, look at all that red on the map. And that's just not an effective way to look at the way that our presidential races are determined. As you can see on the right side map, that's actually a breakdown of population. And so you can see states like New York and California, what we might consider to be typically blue states, quote unquote, also carry with them quite a bit of population. And so while they might not be represented in the geographic map and land, you can see the population totals expressed a little bit more effectively on the other side. So just wanted to make sure that we can see that, because it's going to come up again as we're looking at some of the other maps. We can go to the next slide. So just wanted to go over some key points here. Biden won approximately 87% of the Black population's vote. By the time it's all said and done, we're going to see about a 7 million vote difference between him and President Trump. Trump gained about 46% of the vote. Biden's looking at about 51% of the vote. Despite a pandemic, and this is particularly relevant, I think, for today's conversation, despite the pandemic, we did see a voter registration spike in key states, which ended up actually swinging the election for President-elect Biden. And so in many of the cities in which there were some of the most, intense protests with folks out in the streets crying for justice in the wake of those horrific murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, we saw records being broken in terms of the number of folks that were turning out and getting engaged in the civic process. Just in the first half of June, as you can see there, 1.1 million voters were registered. By comparison, 1.5 million voters registered in the entire month of June in 2016. And that was just in the first half. In Michigan, again, another key state, we saw registration actually triple in the first week of June. As you can remember, that's right about when some of the protests were at their peaks. I also just wanted to point out again, some of those key states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, as we were watching the election results pour in for what felt like forever, right? It was about a week until we finally got those final results. The major cities in those key states were dominated by heavily Black populations that were activated and mobilized by what we think was going on this past summer. And so you can see there, Biden pulled in about 70% of the vote in Milwaukee, 81% in Philadelphia, 68% in Detroit, and 77% in Atlanta. I combined Fulton and DeKalb there, but you can see the overwhelming margins by which Biden was able to win with those in those major cities, heavily Black populations that were turned out and activated and mobilized based on what we saw happening this past summer. You can switch to the next slide. So moving on to Congress, we did see a bit of a shift in the balance of power. Going into this election, the Democrats controlled about 232 seats in the House, and Democrats controlled about 45, I believe, seats in the Senate, which is now up to 46. And all eyes are going to be on Georgia moving forward. But just want to look at some key notes here for the Senate race. If we can go to the next slide. So as you can see there, the Senate, a lot of folks expected that we might win that Democrats might win the Senate. Unfortunately, for depending on what states you were looking at and what states you considered to be winnable or not winnable, that didn't quite come to fruition. We did see that Democrats picked up seats in Arizona and in Colorado with Mark Kelly and Hickenlooper. They did lose Doug Jones's seat in Alabama. Republicans, Susan Collins, Joni Ernst, Tillis, Graham, Daines, all retained their seats in the Senate. But as many of you have been made aware, all eyes are going to be on Georgia going into the special runoffs on January 5th. And those two races will largely determine the balance of the Senate. If the Democrats were to pick up 2 additional seats, which John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock are running against Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue in Georgia, that would then tie up the Senate, which would then leave the tie-breaking vote to Vice President-elect Kamala Harris as the casting of the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. And so that will be a major event, I think, for the country and for the balance of power in the country, and for the determination of where we think this incoming administration will be able to go, depending on what President-elect Biden will have to work with in Congress. One thing that I did want to just make sure that I pointed out for everyone is just how undemocratic the Senate actually is. Even if Democrats were to win both of those seats in Georgia, you'll see that Democratic senators represent at least 20 million voters throughout the country, which compared to the Republican counterparts is just not even close. And so what we're working with is just an inherent imbalance. It's extremely challenging because of the way that the map is designed for Democrats to be able to win as many seats, because Democratic voters tend to be pressed into heavily populated areas and in big cities. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to point out the differences between a standard electoral map and the way that populations are distributed earlier. As you can see, a state like Wyoming has 2 senators, just like a state like California has 2 senators, despite California having upwards of 50 million people. And so that just makes things that much harder for folks that live in urban populations and for cities to have as much of an influence on the national stage, because literally the map is just tilted against the Democrats in terms of being able to accomplish things in electoral fashion. So just wanted to make sure I pointed out that fact there. You can go to the next slide. And then, as everyone has been talking about, the House of Representatives, the Democrats did lose 10 seats in the House of Representatives, as I mentioned earlier, went from 232 to 222. The vast majority of those races that the Democrats did lose were from an overperformance in 2018. And we'll see in the next slide, actually, that almost every single one of those seats were seats that were picked up in 2018. They were largely red districts. that were picked up in the election from a cycle ago, and they were the same districts that we saw go this time around. One of the narratives that came out of the election was that Democrats leaning into progressive ideas and things like defunding the police or Medicare for all or Green New Deal, we've seen a lot of blame be put towards the Democrats who have been embracing these ideas. And as we'll see, that's just not bared out in the data. We can go to the next slide. So all those Democrats that lost those seats, I've got them listed there. There were 2 outstanding seats. That's why you see 12 instead of 10. But none of those folks ran on any of the issues that we are lifting up within this coalition or within this campaign. None of those folks ran on defunding the police. None of those folks ran on Medicare for All or Green New Deal. In fact, one of them, Max Rose, out of New York's 11th district, actually ran to the right on criminal justice policy, said things like, this is a critical moment where we should be investing in our police even more. And still the Sergeants Benevolent Association, police union, still labeled Rose as a cop hater, and he still lost his race. So there's just not bared out in the data that folks running on our issues and on what we believe is the way to save Black lives and to live in a free and fair and safe society. There's just no data that backs up the claim that that's why these Democrats lost their seats. But I did want to point out that we did see some new champions, new potential champions that we'd like to hopefully see champion the issues that we're lifting up in this coalition. Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush have both gone on record as expressing their support for defund movements and for the reallocation of resources into public services as opposed to the carceral state. And so just wanted to lift up those 2 individuals as folks who we're hoping that we'll be able to work with in the future to advance the causes that this coalition is championing. Can go to the next slide. And then I just wanted to also point out some justice-related priorities that we're hoping we'll be able to move in this next Congress. We know that everything is looking at the races in Georgia, and that will largely determine whether or not we're able to move some of these initiatives. But some things that different organizations that are a member of this coalition have embraced, the MORE Act, which the House has recently moved, which is actually landmark legislation. It's the first national legislation to go this far on decriminalization of marijuana. Again, what happens in the Senate will largely dictate, I think, what we see moving forward with legislation like that. But that is a priority given the outrageous number of individuals that have had their lives ruined by marijuana prohibition. It's not something that keeps our communities healthy or safe by that continued prohibition. So we're hoping we can move that moving forward. Similarly, COVID-19 relief. Actually, in just this past Congress and the HEROES Act, which passed in the House, there's about $600 million in that piece of legislation that was dedicated towards decarceral policy to actually look towards having states and localities decrease their prison populations given the rampant spread of the virus in those prisons. We're hoping that we'll see some movement on that issue again in the next Congress. If these folks are really with us when it comes to mitigating the spread of the virus, we would expect that they would also be with us when it comes to decreasing the populations in our prisons to ensure that those folks aren't being unnecessarily exposed to a virus. Similarly, pretrial justice reform is another area that we'd like to see some movement. We've seen Congress pass legislation that can incentivize states to end things like cash bail and change a lot of the policies that have, again, increased the number of folks we're seeing in prisons and make it that much harder for folks to get their lives together. And then finally, appropriations is just a major budgetary issue that we see Congress dealing with. And we're hoping that we can convince these members to vote against putting billions more dollars into things like the COPS program, which we mentioned at the top of the presentation. Billions of dollars are going into state and local police forces, as opposed to things like housing, healthcare, and education. We're in the middle of, we're approaching an eviction crisis, and we can't get Congress to pass things like rent control or to protect our folks who are having to take care of their children by educating them at home. And yet Congress is continuing to funnel billions of dollars into the carceral state and flooding our cities with federal law enforcement agents. None of that is keeping our communities safe, healthy, or free. And so we're hoping that we can move Congress to actually embrace some of these ideas, to embrace the things that keep our communities safe, and to move away from investing so heavily into the criminal legal system. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Tracy.
Thank you, Dave. With everything that you just laid out for us, I feel like it's very daunting and I feel very informed. We wanted to have a conversation about what does this all mean for the defund movement. So we are fortunate to have two people who I have been following and whose work I have been admiring for years. So next slide. We have Carissa from Movement for Black Lives and Monifa from Time's Up. And so we're going to get rid of the slides and we're going to bring the two of them up. And we're calling it a panel, but I'm hoping it's a little bit of a conversation because they have so much to offer. So I have some guided questions, but I hope they don't mind if I take some things from what they've said and also talk about some of the work I've done as well. So for both of y'all, what I'd like to know first, just so people who are listening in can know just your name, pronoun, where you're from, and where you're at, if that's different. And then talk about what is the most important thing about you to the work for the work that you're doing right now. So I will hand that to Carissa first.
Beautiful. Thank you, Tracy. Pleasure to be on with you and the other folks on this call. My name is Carissa. I use she and her pronouns. I am from Oakland, California, currently living in Georgia, and I'm a caramel skinned Black woman with a short haircut and a line down my face. I am here to fangirl Monifa Bandele. Did I say that already? That's why I'm here. What was the question though? Remind me the first question.
What is most important to you about this work?
The most important thing to me about this work is that we, folks who are impacted, are actually charting forward a path for a world that actually allows us to thrive. And it's important that we also acknowledge some of the wins that we've been able to achieve in the last 6 to 8 months. So, you know, over 20 cities nationwide have cut or froze over $100 million in funds that were allocated to the police departments. Over 20 cities have dismantled the police in schools, bans on chemical military grade weapons in 6 cities, on facial recognition in 4 cities. So I think it's important that as we continue to think about what's next for the defund movement, that we're clear that we have some wins under our belt and that we want to continue to build on those.
That's right. I so appreciate you bringing in those wins because we need to celebrate them and let people know that they've happened so that this is not something that people think is impossible. It's possible because we're making it happen right now. So thank you for that. And Monifa, who we've already said we fangirl, can you give us your pronouns, where you're from, where you're at, and what is most important to you about this work?
Yes, so Monifa Bandele, she, her pronouns. I'm from Brooklyn, I'm in Brooklyn, I'm at Brooklyn. And to me, right now, the most important thing about our work is that we have created the conditions for our demands. So I feel like now more than ever before, we're coming in hot. And that just means that we're going to have to actually produce something that is radical, bold, and new for the next generation. So creating these conditions to meet the demands has been so key this year.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you talking about creating the conditions because people think this is new. That they're like just popped up over the summer, and it really didn't. This has been the ground has been laid for this. So I would love for y'all to tell me, whoever wants to take it first, what defund work have you been involved in, and what does that work look like?
So yeah, I think it's important to note that for Black folks, you know, we are in cycles of politicization. And so I think about Hurricane Katrina, I think about Justice for Troy Davis, I think about Jenna 6, I think about Oscar Grant, like all of those things that happened have created like this generation of folks being politicized. And I personally entered into movement work following the assassination of Oscar Grant, who was murdered by the police, our transit police in Oakland. And so folks have been calling for a reinvestment of funds that go to police for a long time. Folks have been calling for alternates to public safety that are not rooted in militarism and harm to Black and brown folks for a very long time. And so this is just a new iteration, and we welcome folks who are landing and coming in with us now. And it's important to acknowledge the history that sits behind this current movement.
Yeah, plus one on all of that. When we this summer in New York launched Defund NYPD, we were sitting around the table with people who I fall alongside with for justice for Amadou Diallo in People's Justice 2000. Amadou Diallo was shot 41 times in 1999 here in New York, in the Bronx. And so for 2 decades, we have always been talking about the fact that the resources that are going into the police department are resources that are harming us, that are killing us, and that we have instead wanted an investment in our folks. And so people who kind of feel like, it dropped out of the sky, like you said, Tracy, or the most annoying part for me is seeing, pundits say, well, it's time to move past protests to policy. Like, we've had clear demands on a local level for a long time. And the beauty of what has happened with the Movement for Black Lives or People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom is that we have been building an infrastructure to make those demands national, to call them in one voice, to put them in one messaging bucket, so that what people are demanding in Oakland and in Atlanta and in Minneapolis and in New York is in sync. And so that's what folks saw. People saw this summer a greater level of infrastructure around our demands and our movements, but these demands are definitely not new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about how I entered into the work. I entered when I was working at an organization in Oakland. And I think that I've even been able to grow. So I used to think about invest, divest as one-to-one. Like, if we take this money out of policing, we can put this much money in education. And I'm thinking, if we take 20 million out of policing and we still need 100 million in education, let's go get the 100 million. And I think that is what makes people nervous, because we're sitting at these tables and they understand that we know how to go get it. And so I'm wondering, why do y'all think there's a disconnect between the majority of elected officials and our folks who are calling for defund?
I think it's pretty clear they have a self-interest in upholding the status quo. So although many folks organized around the last election, I don't think any of my folks in the Movement for Black Lives are unclear about the role of neoliberalism and the role of the Democratic Party has played in advancing neoliberalism. And so, at its root, policing is to protect capital, and Democrats are interested in protecting capital at the same time. And so it takes folks like the Squad, Cori Bush, who I'm highly inspired by, Jamal Bowman, to be able to advance what folks are feeling and needing in the streets, in legislative chambers. But yeah, I think, as long as racial capitalism exists, we will be in an ongoing fight in terms of what is status quo.
Yeah, and I think, it must be hard, and yeah, I'm being facetious, but it must be hard to have sat in the halls of power for decades, like many of our elected officials have, as Black men, as Black women, and to have failed to create a system of care that stops Black people from being killed at the hands of the state. And so I think there's a couple different battles going on. One, you're dealing with people's own sense of not wanting to kind of like admit what they've been trying and doing and or not trying and doing has failed us. And also really buying into, white supremacist propaganda. We are sold throughout our entire lives this idea that Black people need to be policed in so many ways. You know, I love a study that Color Changed did just about Hollywood and how all of these programs that we've seen that have been like the #1 programs for the last 5 decades, and especially the last 3 decades, but, you know, Law and Order, you know, I hate to call out The Wire, you know, but all of this is police propaganda. And so when you sit in the room with decision makers, people who you feel can look at problems deeply, talk about the root causes, and really sit with you and with rigor and interrogate and plan out systems to address the root, they fall back on this idea that there's some inherent criminality in Black people. And that, but we have to have the police, and we have to be there because there'll be this violence no matter what we put in place. And so it's extremely frustrating. So people have to root out, you know, their own anti-Blackness as Black people, and also be willing to take a step back and say, you know, what we've been doing in the past is not working. There is a new demand on the table. We want more, and they need to be aligned with us, and they need to flank us. And some are, and for the ones that aren't, they're being replaced by the Cori Bushes and the Jamal Bowmans, you know, and the squad that's growing and growing and growing. So it's really frustrating because, you know, we're fighting the collective imagination of like our folks in our community too, because you also have people in the community that's like, I'm gonna call the police, right? But the decision makers and the people in power, they know there is systemic issues. They know that this isn't like some epidemic of mass failings of individual Black people that causes violence in our communities. And yet they still fall back, you know, on these ideas and these concepts, and they push against our solutions because in many ways they're fighting against the idea that they have failed.
I really love that you brought in propaganda that we see on TV and in the movies. I think about that a lot. You know, Dick Wolf has been giving the police PR for 30 years, and we've had to sit there and watch it, and it's some of the top-rated TV shows. And even shows, I talk about like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is like based in a police precinct. They could be in the DMV, and it could be the same show. And so how it normalizes policing in our lives. There's a question in the chat, and I kind of want to combine that with a question I have with you for you is, why is defund specifically the demand? And, you know, we're saying it's a hashtag more than a slogan on Twitter right now. So want to know, why is defund the specific demand? What are some investments that people are calling for in our community? And then what do you think about that as the word choice?
Yeah,
it's a weighty question.
It is. Thank you for lifting that up, and thank you for the person who put that forward. You know, we are in the business of making what's not politically possible. And so when Black Lives Matter was used as a slogan, people were like, no, this is divisive. This is not language that we want to use, and policed it, right? So, you know, as Monifa was naming, around the work is not just around folks who are legislators, lawmakers, et cetera, but it's some internal work. We actually have to kill the cop in our head. And that's connected to the language we use, et cetera. And so now, fast forward from when Black Lives Matter as a slogan was being looked at as unstrategic, we're now in the same boat with defund. And folks have been defunding services for Black people historically for a very long time. And so I want folks to get less uncomfortable with the word and more uncomfortable with the conditions. And that's an invitation for all of us to do that.
Yeah, I would actually love, you know, I love the presentation by you, Tracy and Dave. And, you know, actually the COPS program, which was listed, the Republicans have been trying to defund the COPS program for decades. They love to defund stuff, right? It's all about smaller government, right? Less spending. So in many ways, no matter what we would have said, it would have been used, you know, against folks who were running in these various congressional districts, even if they ran against it, you know what I'm saying? It's something they could just latch onto. And our folks, people who we would like to be in partnership, who we would like to be champions for this demand, have not really sat and become sophisticated enough to create messaging that will counter that, will take people through to another discussion instead of just getting in this back and forth about what is and isn't meant by defund. We've been really clear, you know, from Juneteenth 2020, when the demands went out and when the signs went up to defund the police, you can click on it, and we explained in detail, you know, that defund the police is a call for more safety, not less safety. That's been very clear. You know, someone used an analogy earlier today about someone being operated on, right? So a person's on the operating table and you need to repair their organs, right? But at the same time, they're hemorrhaging, they're bleeding, right? And so you're all focused on like, we need to repair the heart, we need to repair the lungs, but you also have to stop the bleeding, right? So it isn't just about the investing. We also have to turn off this outflow of resources into the criminal legal system that is harming us, that will kill us. So defund is very important. We took time, we defined it. It's based on a policy platform called the Vision for Black Lives that's been around for 5 years with the Invest, Divest framework. And I also believe that it's important to actually challenge people with the language that you put forth. If you put out messaging that's going to drastically alter life as you know it, and people aren't at first uncomfortable with that conversation, then you're probably not going to get to a place where you completely reimagine public safety. So this is the uncomfortable moment where, whether it is at the table, you know, during your family gatherings, or it's in a meeting with your local elected official, you know, we are really pushing, and we are we're forcing them to interrogate what the norms, what their preconceived notions are about safety. That's going to be uncomfortable. There's nothing we could come with that wasn't going to ruffle some feathers, that wasn't going to be prickly. I do want to say this about those congressional districts really quickly. You know, I keep saying like Black girl magic doesn't work like that, right? On one hand, it's like we won the White House, and then in the same breath, are responsible for losing 10 seats in the House in districts where Black people don't even live. You know, like when you look at the demographics, you talked about this congressional district in New York, you know? So we will be blamed. So we're kind of used to that. We go into our organizing and into our strategy sessions knowing. And what we're not going to do is pull back what our demands are. What we're not going to do is pull back our imagination. What we're not going to do is pull back how far we want to go in order to make people comfortable with the language.
Yeah, and if I could just add one more thing real quick, Tracy.
Absolutely.
We also didn't, you know, obviously the movement for Black Lives is made up of an ecosystem of 150 Black-led organizations that helped advance the defund, but it also was people in the streets, unorganized people who were like, yes, that speaks to what I feel, that the police have too much money, and you know, our ability to get housing stability, to get health insurance, all of those things are deprioritized in service of resourcing the police. And so part of it is not even up to us as a movement. Like we are a movement, and there are so many unorganized forces that also latched onto that language. And so, you know, it doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like an accurate question to say, why are you using this language? We're the movement, you know, full demographics of folks are using this language, and we support it, obviously, and are excited about it.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate all of that. Thank you all so much for wrapping that up. And there was another follow-up that I kind of want to address, and it was why not a more positive spin, such as reinventing policing? And I want to point back to something Carissa said, which is this is an uncomfortable condition, so there isn't a positive spin to put on it. And I also think that we don't want people to take our demand and make it something that it's not. So reinvent policing can end up meaning more cameras in place of cops, and that's not what we want either. We don't want our people surveilled, we don't want our people incarcerated, and we don't want our people policed. And so reinventing policing is actually not the goal. Taking policing out of our community is the goal, and doing that through taking away their funding. I think the words are important because tied to an actual policy demand. It's not just a budget demand, it's a demand for safety because police are not keeping our community safe.
Yeah, and I would just also reiterate what Monifa lifted up, that it doesn't matter what language we would use. To some extent, like folks who are antagonistic to our vision would respond. Like I live in Georgia. The level of, you know, political commercials we're getting right now coming from California, like we don't get political commercials in California. We might get a little proposition situation, but like it is wild. And if the things that they were saying about Warnock and Ossoff, and even what they were saying about Biden during the general election were true, we actually wouldn't need to organize. They're like, these socialists, they are, you know, so it's like, obviously they're not socialists. They're capitalists and they're neoliberals. And so, you know, we have to just be cognizant that there's nothing that oppressed grouping of people can say around their vision and their values that folks who are doing the oppressing, that want to continue to do the oppressing, whether it's an institution or individuals, will feel aligned with and feel comfortable with. And so I think that's just an important piece to lift up.
Yeah, and I want to add that those things that people are saying, well, why don't you say, I think you threw out reinvent the police, and, you know, why don't you say better police, or, you know, more transparent police, or accountability for police. The thing is, like Carissa said, this is an ecosystem of over 150 organizations that have been doing this work, some for past 6 years and some for the past 20 years. And we've done all that. Like, we have actually led campaigns and won many of the reforms that people of today was like, you know what, really will help? If we ban chokeholds. We banned chokeholds in New York for the NYPD a decade before Eric Garner was strangled to death. You know, they say, oh, you know what you really need? You need these special prosecutors. You got to have a special prosecutor in place, and then the police will go to prison. We won special prosecutor six years ago, unable to prosecute police. You know, all of we were not pushing body cams, but people were pushing body cameras. Now we get to watch our loved ones die on video from various perspectives. You know, so it's really frustrating because all of the counter, you know, recommendations on messaging and on asks are as if people don't realize that our ecosystem is made up of people on the ground, organizers that have been trying these things. We've come to a moment where even greater numbers of us realize that the whole current system of policing needs to be turned on its head, and that those resources need to be pushed into public health, pushed into housing. Like there's unanimous position that has arisen because we are sharing our experiences, and we're realizing that it's not just they have outsized budgets. The police have outsized political power through the police unions, right? So there's a dismantling of power that comes with shrinking the size and the scope of our police departments.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. I'm going to combine them because we're almost out of time. So I would love to hear from y'all. What are some of the things that we're talking about defunding the police, and the thing that we know on the other side is funding for other things. So what are communities that you're working with calling to be funded, and where do you see this work headed next?
Monifa, you want to start us?
Okay, sure. So for me here in Brooklyn, you know, a big thing for us, and there's so many, we actually put together a report, Defund NYPD, where we actually outline if we cut the budget by 1 billion, kind of like where we want that money to go. We're going to come in harder and hotter this year with an even deeper proposed cut. But what comes to mind is our mental health infrastructure. So in New York State, the mental health infrastructure has been defunded over the past decades. And in fact, it's to the point where, you know, there's no mental health beds, even right here on my own block. I have an amazing neighbor who has a mental health crisis about twice a month. And people can't call 911 because there's no one to come. You know, there's no place for her to go. The care system that we're fighting for right now is not in place. And so when we see what happened with Walter Wallace in Philadelphia, or even Daniel Prude in Rochester, is really triggering for New Yorkers, because we have Muhammad Ba, and we have many Muhammad Bas every year, but Muhammad Ba was having an emotional health crisis, and his mother called for an ambulance. And instead, the police came and killed Muhammad. And this is what happens in our communities day in and day out. And so when we have done workshops and listening sessions about what does safety look like, and asking community members to like really reimagine what could happen if we defund the police, that always rises to the top. We need to heal from the decades and centuries of trauma through white terror, what our kids experience in school, what we go through in the hospitals. And that type of repair should absolutely come in the form of reparations, but there's also a mental and an emotional and a health healing that needs to happen, and it needs to be resourced in order to be scaled to the magnitude that's needed for how much our folks have suffered.
So Monifa also is one of the leaders in the Movement for Black Lives who helped to write the Breathe Act, which is federal legislation that seeks to divest, defund the police, and invest in various services that will meet our needs. It's not just about policing, it's actually an omnibus bill that speaks to many things. And so we're trying to advance that. We're also working with our member organizations to advance it at a state level. And so if you're in Illinois right now, they're trying to pass the Illinois Breathe Act. And we believe that that will happen across the country in 2021. We're also really invested in building local power. Connected to that is building alternatives. And so, as Monifa lifted up, access to real mental health services, et cetera, has long plagued our communities. And so folks at this point are also like, we're just gonna build what we need. And so I'm inspired by projects like Mayday Medics out of Sacramento, that is a project of the Anti-Police Terror Project Sacramento chapter, where they have built a rapid response mobile team to respond to mental health crises. So folks don't have to call the police, knowing that it actually causes grave danger for our folks. And so through the Local Power Project, we're going to be exploring in various cities across the country. What do alternatives, not only to public safety, but the Movement for Black Lives is invested in many structural changes around issues that impact Black folks. And so we'll be looking at alternatives to energy, alternatives to health, alternatives to food systems. And so I think that's what I'm most excited about in 2021 in terms of where we see this work moving.
And Kamala said we have time for a couple more questions that were in the chat. So I'll just put them out for anybody who wants to try to answer it. I'm going to reframe this one. To what extent does the movement that has arisen from Black people being killed focus on supporting the families of the folks left behind? Are we doing work to support them? And are we trying to make sure that they don't feel like props for the movement, but actually feel supported and loved by the movement?
Yeah, it varies. There's a lot of great local work happening to support families, to organize families. There's different organizations that have sprung up, like Mothers Against Police Brutality in Texas, and then Justice Committee here in New York. And there's stuff all over the country, definitely not just those two. And supporting them, bringing them into our larger ecosystem is like a high priority. But I also want to say that a component of the Breathe Act specifically talks about addressing survivors and making sure that families of victims of state violence receive reparations. We actually worked on that component of the bill with survivors of people who lost loved ones to the police. So there's both thought leadership that is happening in drafting the policies and the legislation, but also helping to bring together the organizations that exist from survivors. But definitely more and better work needs to be done.
Thank you. And somebody dropped in the chat, they were brought up before, but Anti-Police Terror Project, which is based in the Bay Area, they also have, they also do support for families in addition to the first responding program. So I wanted to make sure that we highlighted them as well. Mm-hmm. And then there's a question about the 94 crime bill specifically, and I can take it a little bit, and then we'd love for y'all to jump in. It's just about, if we're wondering if we can talk about the effects of the crime bill and how the perspective on the bill has changed or not changed. And so for me, when I think about the bill, I think about it as this shift in the way we talked about people. Even the way the bill was passed, if you go back and listen to some of the floor speeches, Joe Biden gave a really upsetting floor speech about how we have to separate people away from their communities. And so it was this understanding that the way to deal with any violence in a city was through policing and incarceration. And so it created, I think, an ecosystem, if that's a word that we can continue to use, at the state and federal, state and local levels, that said, we need to incarcerate more, we need to police more, instead of doing the things that we know will care for folks. And so people were given money and incentivized to take people out of the community. And so I think that we know, and folks, even at the time, knew that this was wrong. And something that people don't talk about is that there was a lot of pushback about the bill at the time. So I think now, especially with the People's Coalition, we are centered in doing a people's process. People will say about the 94 crime bill, folks knew or people asked for this, and we know our people didn't ask for this. And so with the people's process, they can no longer use that excuse. Our folks will be centered in drafting the bill. Our folks will be centered in lobbying for the bill. And so when you ask who wants this, it'll be the people that we're working with and the people who have been the most directly impacted.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, fear, people kind of use fear to steer you in whatever direction they want you to go. And we see that not only on the right, but also on the left, and also with neoliberals. And so, 2 weeks ago, right here where I live around the corner, 7 young people were shot over on Albany Avenue and Fulton Street, and 1 died. And the pushback that we keep getting around, there's these spikes in crime and, don't you want something in place to deal with the violence? And our response to that is that the people who show up after the violence happens, in our opinion, those are not the first responders, right? That is of no consequence to me that you've showed up now, that 7 children in my community and 1 is dead and now you're there, right? We want to put in place a system of care where there's a first responder that responds to the crisis before the violence, right? There's a violence that was happening before this visible violence happened, and we don't have anything in place to address that. And so the 94 crime bill kind of went in where, people were hurting, people were dealing with trauma, and were basically able to use that, to fan fear amongst the community in order to really not see that this was essentially a way to protect other communities from our community. Like when you really unpack the bill and you unpack what it's doing, it was about containing and controlling Black communities in a way that they wouldn't infringe on white communities. But that was not how it was messaged. So we try to have grace. We try to build a bridge, between our folks who still haven't made their way over the bridge into abolition, just to ask them, but what would you really want to have happen? And all the time, each and every time, people want the violence to not happen in the first place. People want preventative measures, but they're just not being put into those conversations. But, we believe in the brilliance of our folks. And so we continue to push them. When you challenge people, that's love, and when you build consensus instead of following consensus, that's leadership. So we need that combination of love and of leadership. And I think we're going to win in short order.
I don't know how to follow that because it was just brilliant. Thank y'all so much for your time tonight, for sharing so much with us, for teaching us. and for doing it so lovingly. We appreciate you. Thank you. Do y'all have any last words before we end this section?
I see folks want to help with Defund and Breathe. I guess it's indivisible. So yeah, I'm sure that we can link with the contact list, and we will follow up with everybody that wants to get down.
Yeah, the only thing that I would say is that this moment requires a constant commitment to a radical imagination. And so what you thought was politically possible, the slow churn of transformation is ready to be sped up. And so be agents with us in speeding up that process.
I know that's right. Well, thank y'all again for your brilliance. Greatly appreciated. We're going to bring those slides back up because we have kind of a final word on this section from Deatra Jackson or Dee. If you go to the next slide, it's a quote that we'll read out. So when we talk about defunding police, it's always a negotiation that we have to make. But we don't have those same conversations when we defund education, defund healthcare, defund the services and programs our communities need. The police continue to have what they need and our communities do not. What is more possible when we have what we need? A world that doesn't rely on exploitation and violence. And so with that, we're going to close out this section and we're going to hand it over to Kamau to tell us what is next.
Thanks, Tracy. Peace, everybody. My name is Kamau. I'm the coordinator for this coalition of PCSF. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm based here in Brooklyn. Thank you so much to everybody that took the time out to join us tonight. I know that there's so much going on in the world right now, and so you sharing this time with us is really greatly appreciated. Also, obviously, want to thank Carissa and Monifa. I was fanboying during the entire panel, and I just continue to be deeply indebted to y'all's wisdom and leadership. So I appreciate y'all. I want to talk a little bit about where we're heading next, both within our organization and kind of nationally, to give folks an opportunity to plug into being parts of the solution and executing a lot of the plans that we've talked about tonight. And so with our coalition, our goal is to really kind of shift the way that we talk about making policy and try to invert the relationship that we have with the people that make policy. Carissa touched on, and a lot of other folks have touched on tonight, we need to have a radical imagination. And I agree with that. The coalition agrees with that. And one of the main goals at the foundation of the people's process that we want to move forward with is kind of breaking this cycle of making policy from a standpoint of hoping not to alienate elected officials and trying to make sure that our demands fit within what they're comfortable with, because that's not the way that democracy is supposed to work, right? It's supposed to be that the elected officials are responsive to the demands that we make. And so moving forward, that's the process that we want to implement ourselves and hopefully model for the future. Next slide. So the people's process that's going to be undertaken by our coalition has a lot of goals, and they're listed here. I'm going to run through them really quickly so folks can have this to think about and see how they can commit to it moving forward. So we want to catalyze national attention to repeal and replace the '94 crime bill with policy proposals that are coming out of the process that we're going to be implementing. Of course, as it has been mentioned over the course of tonight, we want to center the stories and the expertise of communities and individuals that are directly impacted, right? Because when you think about it, it doesn't make sense for people making policy to have that much responsibility and power if they're not actually directly impacted by the results of that policy. But that's the system that we have, and we need to do something different, and we need to do something better. So in order to do that, we're going to support local power and capacity, engage in mass political education for folks to deepen and develop their understandings of the PIC, the prison industrial complex, and develop language that prioritizes investments in our communities, the things that our folks know that we need. because we're the ones that are making these demands. And finally, just like imagining alternatives to incarceration and safety, bringing people together to discuss, like we did tonight, what actually keeps us safe outside of the carceral state, just like cages and people throwing us into them constantly and consistently. Next slide. So get plugged in, join us. We're really looking forward to what 2021 can bring for us on our fight to make these things happen. So if you are a part of an organization, or even if you're not, we want you to join in. If you're interested in co-creating and reimagining what safety looks like and what safety can mean, we want you to join us. So make sure you check out our website, safetyandfreedom.org. Our socials, Instagram, People's Coalition, Twitter, People's Coalition. And if you fill out this link that I can also drop into the chat right now, it's bit.ly/interest.pp. And so if you go to this link and you click this, what's going to happen is somebody from our coalition will reach out to you and talk about next steps in terms of getting involved in the people's process in 2021 as we move forward, trying to make sure that we get what we need from our elected officials. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up. I really appreciate everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you again to Tracy and Dave for their contributions, Monifa and Carissa for your wisdom, and shout out to Danae as well for providing us with our captioning. We're looking forward to moving forward with you all and building with you into the next year. Thanks again for coming, and take care.
Thanks so much for joining, everyone.